Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history gets weird, but the voice stays calm. Tonight, we're wandering across the Silk Road, a path that was never really a single road, more like a tangled web of good intentions, broken treaties, and occasionally profitable camels. It began as a Han Dynasty security project, meant to stop raids from the west. 2,000 years later, it has turned into a metaphor for connection, cooperation, and a surprising amount of sand. Before you settle in and get cozy, take a quiet moment to like the video or subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy falling asleep to humanity's better ideas, slowly turning into tax paperwork. And when you're ready, drop a comment telling where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's strangely comforting to know how many of us are awake at the wrong hour, each in our own little corner of history. Now, dim the lights. Let the room grow still. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's drift together through the entire history of the Silk Road. A journey that started with horses, carried religions, built empires, and still hasn't quite stopped moving. If your mind drifts, that's perfectly fine. The caravans will keep going without you. You begin, as many great mistakes do, with a plan to improve border security. Around the 2nd century before the Common Era, China under Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty faced a serious problem: horse thieves who owned entire countries. The Xiongnu Confederation raided northern settlements like it was a sport. So Emperor Wu sent his envoy, Zhang Qian, to find new allies in Central Asia, a diplomatic mission dressed in adventure. Zhang was captured, escaped, and came home years later with stories of strange fruits, finer horses, and people who had never heard of the emperor who paid his salary. That was enough to spark an idea. If alliances were unreliable, perhaps trade could do the job. Security through commerce. Still a favourite government theory, even now. And so the first deliberate connections between East Asia and Central Asia began, thin and fragile, like a line of footprints blown by desert wind. The first road was not a road at all. It was a shifting series of routes across the Tarim Basin, curving through oasis towns that clung to water the way a merchant clings to profit. Names like Kashgar, Khotan and Turpan would echo for centuries as waypoints between worlds. Each was a pocket of life surrounded by the kind of emptiness that makes you hear your own breathing. Sandstorms erased landmarks, rivers disappeared into salt flats, travellers marked the way with dead camels, an early, if grim, form of signage. The caravans followed the seasons, leaving in spring when the grass could feed the animals and returning before the snow sealed the passes. Their guides navigated by stars, bones and gossip. The double-humped Bactrian camel became the ship of this dry sea, patient, moody, and likely to spit at your leadership. They carried silk, jade, and lacquerware westward and brought back glass, wool, spices, and stories that smelled of other gods. Somewhere along the route, a remarkable thing happened. Markets began to grow around the military outposts. A fort might start as a garrison and end up selling carpets. Soldiers moonlighted as traders. Officials taxed what they didn't understand. Even bandits found employment as unofficial toll collectors. The line between policing and profiteering blurred, a tradition that survives beautifully in bureaucracy. The early Silk Road was less about silk and more about information disguised as luggage. Maps, techniques, recipes, and even medical ideas slipped between languages. One traveller might bring grapes and glasswork, another paper and powders that could heal or explode depending on instructions. Historians later described this as technological diffusion. You could also call it curiosity with luggage space. The Han government, of course, tried to organise it all. They built watchtowers, stocked way stations, and even minted silver coins to standardise trade. But in a landscape this big, control was a polite illusion. A merchant's loyalty was to profit and safe passage in that order. Still, the system worked, because everyone wanted something the other side had. Rome craved silk, China admired glass, and both empires wrote poems about the other without ever meeting. If you were a trader, your days were long and mostly beige. The horizon never changed, only the temperature. You ate dried meat, drank fermented milk, and trusted that your camel knew what it was doing. At night, the desert turned cold enough to make your bones sound like ceramic. And above it all, the stars hung steady, silent accountants of distance and debt. Zhang Qian never lived to see the full network bloom, but his failed mission became the seed of one of humanity's longest-running experiments in cooperation, a chain of markets, monasteries, and misunderstandings that linked Xi'an to Antioch, and later to everything in between. In the end, the Silk Road didn't start with merchants. It started with fear and evolved into fascination. A path that began as a military corridor quietly transformed into the first global rumour mill. The soldiers kept their armour, the camels kept their attitude, and the world for the first time began to share its curiosities across the dust. Somewhere between a border wall and a bazaar, civilization found its favourite compromise: profit in the name of peace. You continue west, where the air grows thin and reasoning grows thinner. Between the oases, the land becomes a laboratory for patience. The locals call it the Taklamakan. You go in, but you do not come out. A name that feels less like a warning and more like a customer review. Here, the Silk Road divides into choices that are all bad in their own ways. The northern route hugs the mountains, cold and treacherous but rich in water. The southern path crosses the dunes, shorter, deadlier, and filled with the kind of silence that makes you apologise to your own thoughts. Caravans often sent scouts first, mostly because they were replaceable. They returned with useful information, or didn't return at all. You travel at dawn to escape the heat, and again by moonlight to escape your own company. The day is an oven, the night a freezer with stars for punctuation. Every horizon looks identical, beige, endless, and slightly disappointing. Guides count dunes like accountants of despair. They follow dry riverbeds that might, if you're lucky, lead to a well that hasn't yet given up. In this world, survival depends on mathematics softer than numbers, on the feel of wind, on the angle of a shadow, on how long a camel can sulk before it collapses. Water is measured not in jars but in hours of walking left before someone begins praying aloud. The air smells of dust, leather, and resignation. The caravans stretch out, hundreds of animals tied in patient sequence, carrying bolts of silk, sacks of spices, sometimes letters sealed in clay. Each step raises a small question of faith in the ground ahead. The rhythm of bells and grunts becomes hypnotic. Travellers begin to dream while awake, imagining they're already somewhere else, a side effect that scholars later called road fever, though it might have just been boredom in extreme heat. Every few days a caravanserai breaks the monotony, a walled rest stop built from mud bricks and optimism. Inside, merchants barter gossip as eagerly as goods. They share water, salt, and stories that grow taller with every retelling. News of politics travels faster than the mail. One man swears the Roman Empire has fallen, another insists it's buying more silk than ever. In a way, both are right. History depends on the route you took to hear it. The caravanserai is an institution worth respecting. It offered shelter to strangers without questions, a concept that felt radical in most centuries. Its architecture followed one rule: keep the outside hostile, so the inside feels like a miracle. Courtyards filled with animals, oil lamps and cooking smoke. Someone tunes a lute. Someone counts coins. For a moment, the desert steps aside, and the human voice wins. When you leave again, the emptiness returns louder than before. Sand gets everywhere, in clothes, in maps, in philosophy. It shapes how people think, slowly, cautiously, and with an appreciation for small details. A desert teaches humility by demonstration. Even the wind seems to be correcting you. Yet trade somehow grows. By the 1st century of the Common Era, silk from China appears in Roman markets. The fabric is so light that senators accuse women of indecency for wearing it. The Senate debates a ban, fails, and keeps buying. Meanwhile, glassware from Syria travels east, baffling craftsmen who think the material must be frozen rain. From India come spices that make food smell edible again. Every object carries its own confusion, proof that misunderstanding can be profitable. Somewhere between dunes and mountains, new crops appear. Grapes, pomegranates, and alfalfa for horses. They move invisibly through seeds stuck in saddlebags or gifts exchanged in gratitude. Even medicine migrates. One caravan brings the secret of a plant that cools fever. Another returns with powders that clean wounds. Doctors along the route learn by trial, error, and rumours that happen to work. To keep trade moving, local rulers begin setting up guard posts and tolls. They claim to provide protection, but mostly provide inconvenience. Taxes are invented anew at every gate. Still, the merchants endure it all, because each checkpoint offers proof that the road continues. Better a toll than a tomb. What's remarkable isn't that people survived the desert, it's that they kept coming back. Because this road offered something rarer than safety. Opportunity. You could be a nobody in one town and a foreign curiosity in the next. A man with nothing but silk and courage could become wealthy, or at least well-travelled, which was sometimes more impressive. In an age before passports, your reputation was your paperwork. Credit depended on how well you told the story of your honesty. At night, under a sky so crowded it looks like spilled salt, travellers rehearse their lies for the next market. They promise rare goods, royal connections, or simply that their camels are less cursed than others. The stars listen politely as they always do. Somewhere far behind, another caravan follows the same path, guided by the same stories, repeating the same human pattern. Fear, greed, wonder, and a faint hope that tomorrow's sand will be kinder. No one ever truly conquered the desert. They only negotiated temporary terms with it, paid in sweat, faith, and the occasional camel. The Silk Road was less a highway than a series of hesitant footprints that somehow never blew away. And in each grain of sand, the world was quietly becoming smaller. The miracle isn't that people crossed these distances, it's that they thought it was worth trying. Because curiosity, once it packs its bags, rarely stays home again. Somewhere between the dunes and the dreams, trade stops being local and quietly turns global. By the time the 1st century of the Common Era rolls around, a strand of silk has already made its way from China to Rome, a small shimmering thread connecting two worlds that don't even believe the other truly exists. No single traveller makes the full journey. The goods change hands a dozen times, carried by strangers who share nothing except dust and an instinct for profit. Yet somehow, the thread holds. Silk was more than a luxury fabric. It was a soft, portable form of diplomacy. Each bolt of cloth said, without words, "Look what our worms can do that yours cannot." The Romans adored it. They draped their senators in translucent layers until moralists in togas began shouting that civilization itself was in danger. The Senate debated banning silk entirely, which of course only made it more fashionable. The merchants smiled quietly and kept selling. Rome's coined silver began flowing east like a river of regret. Meanwhile, Chinese officials were delighted to collect gold in exchange for something that grew out of mulberry leaves. It felt like a clever trick, nature's version of alchemy. But the empire also noticed an alarming detail. Gold goes out, silk goes west, and sometimes the gold doesn't come back. So new regulations appeared, trying to manage this invisible leakage of value. Bureaucracy, like the desert, always finds a way to expand. Between these two extremes, the Roman taste for softness and the Chinese love of order had stretched the middlemen. They were the real winners: Parthian traders, Sogdian merchants, and countless caravan masters ran the relay race of civilization, passing goods, languages, and diseases with equal efficiency. Each link in the chain added its own markup and its own rumour. By the time silk reached the Mediterranean, it had crossed 8 tax systems, 3 religions, and at least 1 philosophical crisis. Yet the demand never stopped. Trade, after all, thrives on imagination more than necessity. When one culture dreams of another, someone will sell tickets. And so glassware from Syria travelled east, admired as solid air. Persian silverwork glittered in Chinese courts, where artisans studied it with both envy and opportunity. Spices from India perfumed stews in Samarkand and banquets in Rome, proving that globalization's earliest form was dinner. In return, the East sent lacquerware, paper, and small curiosities that felt almost magical. Compasses before they were called compasses, fireworks before they were weaponized. Every exchange carried a hint of misunderstanding, which in economics is simply another word for profit. The movement of goods created new habits of thought. Wherever trade went, accounting followed. Weights and measures, seals, coins, and the idea of credit all evolved as survival tools. A merchant who trusted another merchant was a revolutionary in his own way. Some developed written contracts, others relied on family reputations passed like heirlooms. In a world without banks, honesty was the only currency that didn't need minting, and when honesty failed, arbitration appeared, the ancestor of insurance, discovered the same way most inventions are after something went wrong. The road also carried strangers who were not merchants. Envoys, monks, doctors, and wanderers followed the same tracks, each chasing a different version of salvation. One brought a new dye that changed the colour of imperial robes. Another brought a herb that could lower fever. Ideas moved faster than armies, spreading through inns, temples, and the occasional board interpreter. This is how astrology met mathematics, how medicine learned geography, and how myth evolved into cartography. By the 2nd century, the Silk Road had become a nervous system running across continents, a fragile but living connection that hummed with exchange. Of course, for every success story, there were 100 misfortunes buried beneath the sand. Caravans vanished in storms, kingdoms rose, taxed, and fell. Some oases simply dried up, erasing whole communities in the time it takes for a map to fade. But commerce has one stubborn rule. If profit exists, someone will risk following it, and so new routes opened whenever old ones failed. It wasn't resilience, it was repetition, disguised as progress. For the people who lived along the road, this constant flow became their normal. They saw more languages than they could count, more gods than they could remember. Markets became classrooms, where a farmer might learn a new way to plant from a traveller who had never touched a plough. In this way, the Silk Road created a kind of unplanned education system, not with teachers, but with travellers. The lessons were uneven but enduring. Curiosity pays, and isolation costs. Sometimes, a deal changed more than just wealth. When grapes arrived in China, they brought with them the concept of wine, and with wine, the concept of celebration. When paper reached the Middle East, it unlocked libraries. When glass reached the East, it changed architecture and self-perception. For the first time, people could see their own reflections clearly, and vanity quickly followed. Civilization, it seems, improves fastest when people are slightly embarrassed by what they look like. By the early centuries of this network, the Silk Road had become an experiment no empire could fully control. Taxes could be raised, guards could be stationed, yet the road always found a way around authority. Empires collapsed, trade detoured, power shifted, goods adapted. It was the closest thing to immortality human ambition had ever built. At night, when the desert cooled and the last fire burned low, merchants would sometimes sit outside their tents, counting coins that still smelled faintly of other hands. They didn't know the road they walked would be remembered for 2 millennia. They just knew it was worth it. The danger, the distance, the effort to carry beauty where it wasn't yet known. because beneath all the silver and silk that was the real cargo, the desire to see what lay beyond the next horizon. And while the road would one day fall quiet under shifting sands, for now it was alive, a living pulse of trade and trust that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. A line on the map drawn not by kings but by footsteps, and if you listened closely, you could almost hear the sound it made, the gentle whisper of fabric being unrolled somewhere between commerce and wonder. The road, once filled with merchants counting coins, soon filled with monks counting prayers. Faith began to travel in the same saddlebags as silk. Wherever trade went, temples and stories followed. Because if you can move silk, you can also move enlightenment, provided you pack it carefully and translate it often. It started with Buddhism, carried by merchants and wanderers through the passes of Bactria and the valleys of Gandhara, places where the air was thin, and ideas had to be simple enough to survive it. The Greeks had left behind their statues, and the sculptors of Gandhara looked at them, looked at their new religion, and thought, why not combine them? Thus appeared the first statues of the Buddha with flowing Greek robes and faces calm as mathematics. The result looked both serene and strangely fashionable. Faith, it turns out, has always known how to borrow good design. From these regions, caravans of monks and merchants set out eastward. They carried not only goods but sutras, rolled scrolls of teachings copied by hand, sealed in boxes and treated like portable wisdom. Some caravans became small moving monasteries, complete with chanting, cooking and philosophical debates, performed loudly enough to frighten the camels. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To them, it was enlightenment in transit. Along the way, Buddhist ideas met local spirits, older gods who refused to retire. In some towns, the result was harmony, in others, confusion. But confusion can be productive. It forced translation, and translation forced thought. Soon, the faith that began in India spoke Sogdian, Tocharian, and eventually Chinese. Each translation added new metaphors, some accidental, some inspired. By the time these texts reached China, they had been rewritten so often that the Buddha might not have recognized his own biography. But that's how faith travels. Less like a message and more like an echo that keeps learning new languages. One of the great waypoints of this religious migration was Bamiyan, a valley in present-day Afghanistan. There, two enormous Buddhas were carved into the cliffs, one as tall as a cathedral, the other only slightly embarrassed by comparison. They watched over the valley for more than 1,000 years, their stone robes rippling as if still caught in a passing wind. To travellers, they were both signposts and guardians, proof that someone had been here before and survived. Caravans passing below often stopped to leave offerings or ask for luck, as if holiness could be borrowed for a few more miles. The Kushan Empire became the great middleman of belief. Its kings understood that religion, like trade, benefits from good marketing. They sponsored monasteries, minted coins showing both Greek deities and Buddhist symbols, and turned their crossroads into classrooms. Faith became fashionable, especially when printed on silver. Further east, in China, Buddhist pilgrims began to move in the opposite direction, following the road back toward India in search of the original texts. Among them were Faxian, Xuanzang and Yijing, names that sound like echoes of determination. Each spent years crossing deserts, mountains and occasional bureaucracies, returning home with thousands of manuscripts and a mild case of disbelief at what they'd survived. Their journeys turned into bestsellers, copied and read by generations who dreamed of travel while never leaving their courtyards. Pilgrimage had become a form of scholarship, and scholarship a form of faith. One of these travellers, Xuanzang, described visiting Nalanda, a university so vast it sounded mythical. 10,000 students, hundreds of teachers, libraries taller than Pride. It was a place where philosophy was debated like a contact sport, and where the air buzzed with argument and incense. When Xuanzang brought its knowledge back east, He carried not only scriptures but a new model of learning, structured, collaborative, and mildly exhausting. From that, the idea of organised education would eventually ripple outward through monasteries and academies, proving that even enlightenment benefits from paperwork. The Silk Road became a string of monasteries and rest stops, spaced a day's travel apart. They offered food, water, and moral advice, sometimes all three at once. These temples doubled as banks, inns, and libraries, storing both relics and rumours. A merchant could deposit money there, or at least faith in the possibility of getting it back. In this way, religion financed itself with hospitality. Every prayer came with free lodging. It was an early example of customer retention strategy, divinely inspired, of course. Meanwhile, artists carried their own version of belief. They painted frescoes inside cave shrines at places like Dunhuang, where the desert meets the Gobi. Over centuries, they layered pigment on pigment until the walls became a visual diary of changing worlds. Indian lotus flowers beside Persian angels, Chinese musicians beside Central Asian dancers. Each cave told a slightly different story, depending on who had paid for the paint. In the 9th century, one monk sealed a chamber filled with tens of thousands of scrolls, a time capsule of an age that had no idea it was ending. The cave remained sealed for nearly 1,000 years. When rediscovered, it revealed that the Silk Road's greatest cargo had always been memory. As the caravans moved, so did tolerance, a rare commodity even in our time. Buddhism coexisted with Zoroastrianism, Nestorian Christianity, Manichaeism, and early Islam, all within a few days' ride of one another. It was a fragile harmony built less on theology and more on shared fatigue. Everyone was too busy surviving to argue for long. That, perhaps, was the secret. Peace by exhaustion. And yet, beneath the prayers and the dust, trade continued. Faith and commerce had merged into one rhythm. Give, take, believe, repeat. A man could buy silk in the morning and earn enlightenment by sunset, depending on which monastery he chose to visit. In this way, the road didn't just move goods, it moved meaning. It turned geography into philosophy, proving that the shortest distance between two ideas is often a footpath lined with tea stalls. So by the time night falls again, and the wind carries the faint echo of chanting across the dunes, you realise something remarkable. The Silk Road has become more than an economy. It has become a conversation between traders and monks, between art and belief, between fear and hope. And though the language keeps changing, the conversation never really ends. If trade was the bloodstream of the Silk Road, translation was its heartbeat. Every traveller carried a few words of someone else's language, usually just enough to ask for water, directions, or mercy. But for the great Buddhist pilgrims who followed the road from China to India, words were everything, sacred, fragile, and constantly in need of repair. They crossed deserts not for profit, but for syntax. You can picture them. One monk, one donkey, and 100 scrolls tied in cloth. The scrolls are heavier than they look, because every line must survive misunderstanding. Each stop along the road becomes a classroom where pronunciation is traded like currency. Someone mishears, someone miswrites, and suddenly a line about compassion turns into a line about cabbages. Entire philosophies hinge on accents. Among the pilgrims, none stands taller in legend than Faxian, Xuanzang, and Yijing. Their journey spans centuries but share the same quiet madness. The belief that truth is portable if you're stubborn enough. Faxian, in the 5th century, left China because he thought the scriptures at home were incomplete. He crossed deserts where the wind erased footprints faster than prayer could replace them. When he finally reached India, he copied everything he could find, then returned by sea on a ship that nearly sank twice. He was over 60 when he got back, hair white, skin burned, carrying scrolls and a sense of unfinished homework. He spent his last years translating, squinting at Sanskrit by lamplight, muttering about how enlightenment required better handwriting. 2 centuries later, Xuanzang repeated the journey, but on an imperial scale. He left Chang'an secretly, breaking travel laws because bureaucracy has always been allergic to adventure. He walked west through Gansu, over the Pamir Mountains and into India, 16 years of dust and discovery. Everywhere he went, he asked questions, filled notebooks, and lectured anyone who stood still long enough. When he finally returned, he brought back 600 original texts and a vocabulary that could confuse even his students. The emperor gave him a welcome parade, perhaps to apologize for almost arresting him. Then there was Yi Jing, who set sail rather than march. He followed the maritime Silk Road through the islands of Southeast Asia, documenting languages, customs, and the correct etiquette for monks who get seasick. He translated hundreds of sutras during long voyages, occasionally running out of ink and switching to improvised pigments. His notes are calm, practical, and occasionally hilarious. The waves were rough, but the Dharma remained steady. If history had a patron saint of polite understatement, it would be him. Their work created something extraordinary, a network of translation centres across Central Asia and China. In places like Kucha, Dunhuang, and later Chang'an, teams of scholars worked together. One read Sanskrit aloud, another explained it in Chinese, and a third wrote it down. The process was slow and full of arguments. Should the word for emptiness mean literal nothingness, or something more poetic like infinite possibility? Meetings ran late, tea ran out. And yet, somehow, entire libraries emerged from this chaos. Translation turned into collaboration, and collaboration turned into invention. When they couldn't find the right word, they made one. That's how philosophy grows, through the polite desperation of scholars facing deadlines. New terms entered Chinese thought: karma, nirvana, bodhisattva. These words became naturalized, like immigrants who never left. They changed not just religion, but language itself, softening its edges, stretching its metaphors. And all this writing needed somewhere to live. So came the monastic scriptoria, quiet rooms filled with scratching brushes and the smell of ink. Monks copied texts day after day, believing that each perfect stroke of the brush built merit for the next life, or at least for the next paragraph. Mistakes were corrected by gluing fresh paper over the old. The result was an archive made of hope, repetition, and paste. One of the greatest collections of these efforts lay hidden for centuries in Dunhuang, in a sealed cave beside the old oasis. Inside were tens of thousands of manuscripts, sutras, poems, legal records, shopping lists, and even doodles drawn by bored scribes. They were sealed away sometime around the 11th century, possibly for protection, possibly because a librarian gave up on organising them. When rediscovered in the early 1900s, they revealed 1,000 years of continuous conversation across Asia. It was like opening the internet, only quieter and better written. These scrolls showed something deeper than devotion. They showed connection. A text written in India could end up in a cave in China, annotated by a monk from Persia. Margins held small miracles. A Chinese note explaining a Sanskrit pun, a Persian line translating a Chinese proverb back into irony. You could see the human fingerprints of misunderstanding turning into art. In a way, the monks of the Silk Road invented global editing. The travellers themselves became legends. In the Tang dynasty, stories of Xuanzang inspired the novel Journey to the West, where his journey was rewritten as an adventure with a talking monkey and a dragon who needed redemption. That story spread across Asia, proving that even scholarship can turn into myth when audiences demand more action scenes. Yet beneath the comedy lay a simple truth. Every journey for wisdom is also a journey through confusion. Translation, in its quiet way, was the Silk Road's most durable trade. Silk wears out, spices rot, empires vanish. But words, once exchanged, rarely stop travelling. The road became a dictionary that never closed, and like all good dictionaries, it was updated constantly. usually by someone tired, underpaid, and slightly hungry. As evening falls, you can imagine one of these monks sitting beside his lamp, brush in hand, eyes half focused from exhaustion. Outside, the desert wind hums. Inside, ink glides across paper, transforming a foreign word into something familiar. He pauses, breathes, and continues. Because somewhere out there, someone will read this line and understand. Maybe not perfectly, but enough. And that, for him, is enlightenment. If the Silk Road were a body, Chang'an was its restless heart, beating, trading, and gossiping in every direction. By the 7th century, this city of walls and gates had grown into the most cosmopolitan capital on earth. Imagine a grid of broad avenues, each lined with markets that smelled of cinnamon, horse sweat, and new money. The Tang dynasty had turned commerce into an art form and bureaucracy into a spectator sport. At sunrise, the streets filled with movement. Camels arrived from the western deserts, ox carts from the south, and river barges from the east. Merchants unloaded silk bolts bright as sunrise, porcelain smooth as arrogance, and bundles of paper, still considered miraculous in Europe, but so common here that shopkeepers used it for wrapping fish. Nearby, a man sold tea from a pot as large as a promise. Tea had only recently become fashionable, partly because it was safer than water, and partly because no one could agree how long to steep it. Taste, like empire, was a matter of control. Within the city walls, order reigned, or at least looked like it did. Chang'an was built according to geometry rather than intuition. Rectangular wards, straight streets, and gates that locked at night as if curfews could stop curiosity. Each ward had its own guards, inspectors, and moral supervisors, a polite term for professional eavesdroppers. The system was meant to keep everything predictable, which of course guaranteed that people would find creative ways around it. Every empire has its loophole artists. One of Chang'an's marvels was the Western Market, an enormous bazaar that seemed to contain half of human civilization in miniature. Here you could find Persian carpets, Roman glass, Indian spices, Sogdian musicians, and money changers who claimed to accept any coin that jingled with sincerity. Languages overlapped in the air like competing bird songs. A Tang official might haggle in Chinese, calculate in Persian, and curse in whatever dialect got the best discount. Business here required multilingual patience and quick fingers. The government encouraged this chaos because it made the empire wealthy. Taxes were efficient, tariffs imaginative, and corruption quietly standardized. Officials drew up the Tang Code, a legal masterpiece that combined Confucian morality with pragmatic accounting. It prescribed punishments for fraud, but also outlined how to appeal them, a thoughtful gesture that implied confidence in bureaucracy's immortality. Historians later praised the Tang Code as a model of balanced justice. Merchants praised it for being readable. Law, trade, and tolerance formed an unlikely trio. Buddhists, Taoists, Muslims, Jews, Nestorian Christians, and Zoroastrians all coexisted within the same city blocks. They built temples that competed mostly in architecture and incense prices. The imperial court saw no problem with this diversity, as long as taxes were paid on time, and heresy didn't block traffic. This fragile tolerance worked, perhaps because nobody was entirely sure whose god was in charge. At night, Chang'an turned theatrical. Street performers filled the squares with drums and fire tricks. Dancers from Central Asia introduced new rhythms, scandalizing Confucian elders who believed enthusiasm was undignified. The imperial palace hosted banquets, where ambassadors from distant lands toasted one another through translators who simplified everything for peacekeeping reasons. Diplomacy was mostly a performance with better costumes. Beyond the glitter, the city pulsed with practical knowledge. Caravans needed repairs, scribes needed ink, and tailors specialized in foreign fashions that looked impressive but were impossible to walk in. Workshops developed new glazes, new pigments, new alloys. Technology spread along with rumour, the recipe for better paper, the trick to refining sugar, the secret of porcelain's impossible whiteness. Each innovation began as a trade secret, then became common sense, then became another tax. In this way, the Tang dynasty quietly invented intellectual property theft centuries before it was given a name. Every road leading into Chang'an carried not only goods but stories. A merchant from Samarkand told tales of elephants that obeyed poetry. A monk from India recited sutras in a rhythm that made courtiers weep without understanding why. A Persian astrologer explained eclipses as cosmic bureaucracy, paperwork in the heavens. The Chinese listeners nodded politely, writing it down just in case it turned out useful. Knowledge, like silk, was worth stockpiling. The city's rhythms were guided by sound. Morning gongs opened the markets, evening drums closed the gates. Between them flowed a steady murmur of bargaining and prayer. Foreign visitors often remarked on how calm it felt, despite its size, as if order itself had been woven into the streets. They didn't see the effort it took to keep that illusion alive. The scribes tallying inventories, the soldiers guarding warehouses, the inspectors checking that everyone looked sufficiently content. Peace, like porcelain, required constant polishing. In the palace archives, bureaucrats documented every tribute gift that entered the empire. Exotic animals, spices, fabrics, and sometimes ambassadors who arrived so late their original kingdoms no longer existed. Yet each gift, once catalogued, became Chinese by definition. This was the genius of Tang diplomacy, assimilation by paperwork. If you could write it down neatly, it was yours. The city's cosmopolitan life reached its peak during festivals. For the Lantern Festival, entire avenues glowed like daylight. Paper lanterns shaped as dragons, phoenixes, and improbable deities swayed in the wind. Crowds moved through the light with faces half lit, half lost. Somewhere, a storyteller recited the adventures of travellers who had never existed, while behind him, a pickpocket demonstrated the timeless balance between art and necessity. The night ended with laughter, candle wax, and the feeling that the world, for once, had agreed on something beautiful. If you walked through Chang'an then, you would have seen an empire confident enough to be curious. The Silk Road had done its work too well. It had turned distance into appetite. Here, on these geometric streets, the global experiment found a temporary home. From this centre, ideas, laws, and aesthetics would radiate outward for centuries, carried by merchants, monks, and the occasional runaway diplomat. As dawn returned and the city gates opened again, the caravans rolled out, heading west toward deserts they already feared and markets they couldn't resist. The hum of trade began anew, the same melody that had been playing for generations. Chang'an had done what few capitals ever manage. It had turned curiosity into policy. And as the dust rose behind departing caravans, the empire looked on, content in the belief that order could coexist with wonder, at least until next quarter's tax reports were due. If you stood on a Chang'an street at dawn, you could hear the world waking up in several languages at once. Temple bells rang from one side, a muezzin called from another, and between them came the sound of traders rearranging their priorities. This was not just a city, it was a polite argument that never ended. And somehow, everyone kept talking. Religions, philosophies, and half-understood rumours of both lived side by side, their shrines separated by courtyards, not continents. You could walk from a Buddhist monastery to a Zoroastrian fire temple in 10 minutes, provided you ignored the food stalls on the way. A Nestorian church shared its neighbourhood with a Taoist shrine and a Confucian academy. No one seemed surprised. After all, on the Silk Road, belief travelled faster than borders. To the Tang emperors, this pluralism was convenient. A city full of competing gods was less likely to unite in rebellion. Tolerance was official policy, though it was called Harmonious Coexistence, which sounds more like a song title than a law. As long as everyone behaved, paid taxes, and didn't predict the emperor's death too loudly, they could worship freely. It was a fragile peace built on shared self-interest, religion moderated by accountancy. Each community left its mark on the city. The Buddhists built tall pagodas that reached toward heaven with architectural optimism. Zoroastrians maintained fire altars that burned day and night, reminding everyone that eternity required constant fuel. Manichaeans painted cosmic diagrams in colours bright enough to make philosophers squint. Nestorians carved crosses with dragon tails, because cultural exchange never knows when to stop. And the new arrivals, followers of Islam, built simple mosques, courtyards open to the sky, pure geometry in a city otherwise addicted to decoration. Music united them all, or at least distracted them from disagreement. Foreign musicians became celebrities at court. Persian lutes, Indian drums, Central Asian flutes, each added a new accent to the empire's soundtrack. Dance followed, swirling fabrics and gestures that scandalized scholars and fascinated everyone else. In the pleasure quarters, Sogdian dancers performed routines of such precision that even the most serious officials occasionally forgot their dignity. Cultural diplomacy, after all, works best when it looks like entertainment. The imperial court treated art as soft power long before the phrase existed. Ambassadors were welcomed with feasts where every course came from a different province, and every performance from a different world. A Turkic musician played, an Indian acrobat balanced plates, and somewhere in the background, a Confucian advisor tried to pretend this was morally uplifting. Politics in Chang'an came with choreography. Even food was international. In the Western markets, cooks experimented shamelessly. Cumin met soy sauce, grapes met noodles, and the results were recorded only in satisfied sighs. Bread baked in round ovens appeared beside steamed buns. Roasted lamb rubbed shoulders with bamboo shoots. If you were rich enough, dinner was a world tour without leaving your chair. If you weren't, you could still smell it and imagine enlightenment through aroma. This constant blending extended to language. The streets echoed with hybrids, Chinese grammar carrying Persian words, Turkic idioms dressed in Mandarin tones. Scribes learned to write names that didn't fit in their alphabets. Translators thrived, some honest, some creative. A single decree might pass through 5 tongues before reaching its destination, losing clarity but gaining poetry. Confusion was not a bug in the system, it was the system. Art reflected this beautiful chaos. Murals in temples showed celestial beings who looked suspiciously multicultural. A Buddha wore Greek folds, an angel borrowed Persian wings, a musician painted centuries later still held a Sogdian harp. Silk scrolls carried scenes of paradise that mixed Indian symbols with Chinese landscapes. Salvation redesigned for local taste. To modernize, it looks like syncretism. To them, it was simply life. Underneath this variety lay a shared rhythm, the rhythm of movement. Pilgrims, traders, and scholars drifted in and out of the city like tides. Each brought something, a text, a song, a recipe, a superstition. Each left something behind, a proverb, a melody, a rumour. Over time, these exchanges became culture itself, not a thing made once, but a conversation always in progress. It wasn't all harmony, of course. Occasionally zealots appeared, declaring their truth the only acceptable import. The Tang court usually responded with polite exile, which was a graceful way of saying, take your certainty elsewhere. But most people understood the unwritten rule. If you can't convert your neighbour, at least sell him lunch. Economics remains the most convincing theology. At night, when the city's gates locked and the noise faded, you could still hear faint sounds drifting through the air. The hum of a hymn, the ring of a temple bell, a distant prayer whispered toward Mecca. They didn't compete. They overlapped like notes in a long chord, each sustaining the others. Even silence here had an accent. This layered music of belief gave Chang'an its personality, a mixture of confidence and curiosity. The people had learned that understanding another faith didn't weaken your own. It just gave you more metaphors to work with. And metaphors like silk were valuable exports. Philosophers debated karma beside Confucian ethics. Astrologers borrowed Arabic calculations to refine Chinese calendars. Knowledge flowed through theology as easily as trade flowed through sand. One Tang poet wrote, "The world comes to our gates and leaves carrying part of us." He meant it proudly, but it was also a warning. Cultural exchange is generous until someone asks who owns the idea afterward, but for now, nobody minded. Chang'an's golden century was still shining, and the road beyond its walls still thrummed with promise. When dawn returned, the city woke again to its favourite habit: curiosity disguised as routine. Pilgrims tightened their robes, merchants checked their ledgers, and priests of every persuasion offered their own version of morning advice. Somewhere, a young musician tuned a foreign stringed instrument, wondering what new sound might come from mixing faith with rhythm. And so, the music of many gods continued, improvised, imperfect, and somehow harmonious enough to last another day. Trade had always depended on muscle, the muscle of men, camels, and the empires that taxed them. But by the 9th century, muscle alone was no longer enough. The Silk Road was getting clever. Ideas began to matter more than caravans. Paper, silver, and faith, 3 very different inventions, found themselves sharing a ledger, and that quietly changed everything. It began, as most economic revolutions do, with a good argument. In the year we now call 751, Chinese and Abbasid forces met at the Battle of Talas, somewhere in the wide, confused geography of Central Asia. The clash itself was unremarkable. Another border misunderstanding dressed up as destiny. But among the captives were a few Chinese paper makers, and that detail turned out to be more important than the battle's outcome. Within a few decades, paper mills began appearing in Samarkand, and suddenly, knowledge stopped depending on stone, silk, or expensive parchment. Writing became portable. If empires are built on memory, then paper was memory on sale. Merchants loved it. No more keeping accounts carved on wooden tablets or whispered across generations. They could now draft promissory notes, simple promises written in ink and hope. One merchant could hand another a folded piece of paper, and somewhere weeks later, someone else would honour it. This was not magic, though it looked like it. It was trust, manufactured, exported, and slightly addictive. The Samanid dynasty of the 10th century turned trust into currency. Their silver coins shone in bazaars from Bukhara to Baghdad, stamped with calligraphy so beautiful that people almost forgot to check the weight. Silver had become a kind of shared language. Even when dynasties changed, the coins stayed persuasive. Merchants began hoarding them not out of greed but out of habit, because good metal is easier to love than good government. Each coin carried both a ruler's name and a subtle warning. Regimes may fall, but arithmetic endures, and where silver couldn't reach, reputation did. Enter the system later known as hawala, informal banking without paper or vaults. It worked on a principle so simple it felt improbable. You give money to a broker here, his cousin gives the same amount to your partner over there, and everyone sleeps well because everyone's honour is at stake. It was the medieval equivalent of wire transfer powered by gossip and conscience. No signatures, no bureaucracy, no interest. Just networks of men whose word was collateral. In theory, it relied on morality. In practice, it relied on fear of losing clients. Trust, like any business model, is most efficient when it's terrified of failure. Alongside trade and money came the idea of waqf, the charitable endowment that built things meant to last longer than donors' egos. A merchant might dedicate a caravanserai, a traveller's inn, to the public good. ensuring a steady income for its upkeep through property or rent. In doing so, he could guarantee both earthly profit and heavenly gratitude. It was an elegant compromise between altruism and brand management. Across the Islamic world, these Waqf institutions became the quiet backbone of infrastructure. Fountains, roads, hospitals, libraries, faith-funded logistics, a practical arrangement between God and accountants. The bazaars of Central Asia became the true capital of this new economy. You could walk through the domed markets of Bukhara or Samarkand and smell the fusion of worlds: metal, mint, sweat, spice, ink, and sometimes ambition burning too fast. Money changers rattled scales like musicians. Jewellery sellers whispered exchange rates disguised as compliments. Clerks dipped reed pens into wells of black ink that looked bottomless. Somewhere nearby, a student copied a text on algebra, numbers behaving politely for the first time in history. The air itself felt organised. Merchants were now professionals, not wanderers. They kept ledgers, employed scribes, and calculated risks with the same seriousness priests used for salvation. Contracts became their scripture, partnerships their creed. Each document began with an invocation of divine trust, so that if the numbers went wrong, they could at least claim good intentions. Interest, officially forbidden, reappeared under more imaginative names: service fees, gratitude gifts, voluntary adjustments. Piety and profit performed a graceful duet. Law adapted as well. Islamic jurisprudence developed detailed rules for trade, inheritance, and partnership. Commerce had become a form of faith in its own right, with moral clauses and spiritual incentives. A dishonest merchant risked his soul as well as his reputation, which is a remarkably efficient form of regulation. Meanwhile, caravans continued to crawl across deserts, but now their real cargo was invisible: confidence. A letter from a banker in Nishapur could buy silk and Kashgar, and both men might die never having met, yet their agreement would stand. The Silk Road had evolved from a path of goods to a path of promises. Outside the markets, rulers tried to tax this new prosperity. They built treasuries and called it order. But money has always travelled faster than authority. Coins disappeared into private vaults, debts hid behind ledgers that no one dared audit. The smarter governors gave up and invested instead, turning their own palaces into commercial hubs. Power, for once, had learned to cooperate with arithmetic. By night, the bazaars grew quiet except for the soft clink of metal being counted by lamplight. A shopkeeper balanced his accounts on a scrap of paper, muttering figures that sounded suspiciously like prayers. Outside, the wind lifted dust into the alleys, carrying with it the faint smell of ink and metal. You could almost hear civilization exhale, content for the moment with its math. This new economy didn't need to conquer to grow. It needed only agreement. It was the first time in history that wealth travelled more by trust than by sword. Merchants became diplomats, bankers became philosophers, and sometimes philosophers became surprisingly good at interest rates. From this blend of commerce and conscience came a stability no empire could command for long, but that trade, in its quiet logic, could sustain for centuries. Some called it divine order, others simply called it good business. Either way, the result was the same: a web of contracts and courtyards connecting half the known world. By the end of the millennium, a merchant leaving Bukhara could carry a letter of credit, a prayer of safety, and a coin bearing 3 different alphabets. And all of them would mean the same thing: trust me, at least until next week. And as the moon rose over the silver roofs, the road itself seemed to shimmer like a ledger left open under candlelight. Proof that the only thing rarer than gold is belief that everyone will play fair. By the 13th century, the Silk Road had become a long, tangled whisper of trade and trust, stretching from the China Sea to the Mediterranean. Then, almost overnight, that whisper turned into a roar, because the Mongols arrived, and they did not whisper. They preferred to announce themselves, usually with hoofbeats and policy reform. At first, the world mistook them for chaos on horseback. They were, admittedly, very good at chaos. But beneath the thunder and dust, the Mongols had a plan to turn the known world into a single, functioning delivery route. In an age when travel could take months and news often died of exhaustion, they managed to invent express shipping. Their secret weapon wasn't only the horse, it was paperwork. Genghis Khan, the empire's founder and reluctant administrator, realized that conquering land was simple compared to keeping it fed. He built a communication network called the Yam, a system of relay stations spaced a day's ride apart, stocked with horses, food, and the occasional suspicious innkeeper. Couriers carrying wooden passports called paisa could travel thousands of kilometers without ever needing to explain themselves. A letter could leave China and arrive in Persia faster than most empires could agree on a calendar. It was bureaucracy at the speed of wind. The Mongols' famous legal code, the Yasa, provided the backbone. It covered everything from military discipline to postal regulations, proving that good logistics is next to godliness. Merchants and diplomats travelling under Mongol protection received stamped documents guaranteeing safety, and woe to any bandit who tested the guarantee. This wasn't generosity, it was enlightened self-interest. Trade brought taxes, and taxes bought more horses. Thus, the empire galloped toward efficiency. Under this protection, the Silk Road reached a level of security it had never known. You could for the first time send a shipment from Xi'an to Constantinople and have a reasonable chance of it arriving in one piece and roughly on time. The Mongols were ruthless in maintaining this order. A caravan robbed was an insult to the empire's reputation. Bandits discovered that the penalty for theft was not only death, but an impressively fast one. Consequently, the road filled again with merchants, pilgrims, and the kind of optimism that only good infrastructure can create. The empire became a strange experiment in global cooperation, powered by fear and curiosity. Information flowed as freely as goods. Astronomers from Baghdad worked in Beijing. Chinese engineers repaired bridges in Iran. Persian doctors brought new medicines to Central Asia, while Buddhist monks carried their manuscripts west. Even the paper makers from Talas found new patrons. If globalization ever needed a logo, it was the Mongol horse galloping beneath an official seal. Europe too woke up to the news that the world was wider than its maps. Missionaries and travellers began following the reopened routes. One of them, William of Rubruck, wrote about his journey to the Mongol court with a tone that hovered between awe and exhaustion. He described camps organised like mobile cities, with every tent in its correct place, as if even chaos had to file a report. The Mongols listened politely to his sermons, then asked more about European winemaking techniques. Faith was interesting, but logistics were universal. Their empire connected nearly all of Eurasia under what later historians called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was not a gentle peace, but it was effective. For roughly a century, you could travel farther, faster, and with less paperwork than you can today. Merchants praised it. Governments pretended to have invented it. Scholars still debate how long it lasted before collapsing under its own administrative brilliance. With safety restored, cities along the route exploded with activity. Karakorum, the Mongol capital, was less a city than a well-organised campsite with world-class imports. Samarkand and Bukhara thrived again, filled with scribes, traders and tea strong enough to dissolve diplomacy. Markets glittered with fabrics, gemstones, and a few diplomats trying to look relevant. The air smelled of metal, horse sweat, and opportunity. Among the Mongols' many innovations was their handling of information. Rulers from China to Persia began keeping detailed records, often on paper imported from faraway mills. Historians like Rashid al-Din, working in the Ilkhanet of Persia, compiled encyclopedias of the known world. He wrote of cultures, kings, and curious creatures, describing China's porcelain and Europe's manners with equal skepticism. His compendium of chronicles was one of the first truly global histories, commissioned, ironically, by conquerors too busy to read it. But empire always has side effects. The same roads that carried prosperity also carried disease. In the mid-14th century, caravans unknowingly transported something far deadlier than silk or spices, the bacterium that would cause the Black Death. What had once been a miracle of connection became a corridor of contagion. In that moment, the world learned the hidden cost of efficiency. Still, for a time, the Mongols achieved what no one else had, a network of roads, cities, and treaties that made continents behave like neighbours. Their system even influenced Europe, where kings, jealous of such organisation, began imitating Mongol couriers and census methods. The irony was delicious, barbarians teaching bureaucracy to the civilised. When the empire finally fractured, it didn't vanish completely. The habits it left behind, passports, postal networks, centralised taxation, outlived the horsemen who invented them. Even today, when you track a parcel across continents, you are following in their hoof prints. The Mongols proved that control, once written down, can travel farther than the conqueror. As night falls across the empty steppes where their empire once rode, you can still imagine the faint rhythm of galloping hooves, not war drums, but messages racing through darkness. Each courier carries a sealed scroll stamped with authority and a bit of fear. He changes horses, drinks from a frozen stream, and disappears again into the horizon. Somewhere behind him, an empire dreams of efficiency. Somewhere ahead, another empire is about to learn its cost. The world has been riding that same horse ever since, faster, louder, and still pretending it's in control. The Silk Road had never been healthier. Caravans rolled safely from the Yellow River to the Mediterranean. The couriers rode like clockwork and the markets glittered with optimism. Trade had become a religion, and the Mongols its high priests. But prosperity has a way of inviting irony. Just as the world grew smaller, something invisible decided to join the ride. It began quietly, as all global disasters do. A few sick merchants in a town whose name the historians argue about. They coughed, they travelled, they traded, and the road kept welcoming them. The same routes that carried silk and silver now carried something lighter than air, smaller than kindness, and infinitely more persuasive: the plague. It moved faster than news, crossing borders that had never even met each other before. By the middle of the 14th century, half of Eurasia was coughing in unison. No one blamed trade at first. Trade was sacred. You don't accuse your favourite miracle of betrayal. People blamed the stars, the wind, or the neighbours, especially the neighbours. In China, drought and famine had already made tempers short. In Europe, fear turned into suspicion, then violence. Everywhere, people agreed on only one thing: someone else must have caused it. The Mongol Empire, once so proud of its infrastructure, found itself exporting misery with industrial efficiency. Its famed relay system, the Yam, delivered not only messages but microbes. Its bustling cities became laboratories for disaster, and its rulers, who had believed in law and logistics more than luck, discovered that no decree could discipline a bacterium. The numbers, which will translate into gentler shapes, are almost too large for comfort. Imagine half your friends gone, then half of whoever's left. That's roughly what the 14th century felt like. Villages vanished, towns fell silent, trade routes turned into graveyards of broken wagons. In some regions, even the officials who were supposed to count the dead were gone, leaving the statistics pleasantly uncertain. Merchants tried to keep the road alive. They sealed letters with wax and hope, avoided crowds and travelled with charms against infection. But fear is a poor business partner. Markets closed, ships stopped docking, and for the first time in centuries, silence stretched between continents. The global experiment paused, coughing into its sleeve. The Black Death didn't care about class, rank, or which god's incense smelled better. It visited emperors and peasants alike and left everyone slightly more democratic in death. Whole families vanished overnight. Cities lost their artisans, monks their libraries, and empires their patience. People began hoarding not money, but prayers. The great machine of exchange built over 2 millennia slowed to a tremor. And yet, in that collapse, the world also learned. Isolation, long considered a punishment, suddenly looked like wisdom. Some villages closed their gates and survived. Others opened them in compassion and disappeared. Doctors experimented wildly, mixing religion with herbal logic. They burned fragrant woods, carried posies of flowers, and argued about whether looking at the sick could make you sick. Science hadn't yet been invented, but curiosity was already contagious. In China, the plague joined a chorus of misfortunes: floods, rebellion, and the slow unravelling of Mongol rule. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty fell, replaced by the Ming, who viewed the outside world as a cautionary tale wrapped in dust. Trade never vanished completely, but it began to travel under stricter supervision. Caravans now needed more papers than camels. Foreigners were tolerated, but only at arm's length, and preferably through a customs window. The once open road began to develop shutters. In the West, Europe staggered but adapted. With fewer workers, labour became valuable. The survivors demanded wages, comfort and explanations. Churches lost authority, medicine gained ambition, and the foundations of a quieter revolution began to form. Misery, it turns out, is also a teacher, though one who charges far too much. For the Silk Road itself, the plague was both a pause and a reset. Many of its great cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, shrank but did not die. They waited, patient as ruins, for commerce to remember them. In their bazaars, weeds grew between paving stones once polished by 1,000 feet. Wind carried the smell of abandoned spices, cloves, cinnamon, pepper, like the ghost of appetite. The sound of haggling was replaced by the sound of wind, which is just haggling with no one to listen. Travellers who ventured out in those years described landscapes half deserted, half haunted. The once crowded caravanserai stood open to the sky, roofs fallen, walls covered with names carved by lonely hands. Even the camels seemed to remember better days, sighing like bureaucrats between assignments. The world had gone quiet, and in that silence, the idea of safety was rewritten. Trade would return, but it would never again be so innocent. When the dust finally settled, something new stirred on the horizon: sails. The same curiosity that had once followed the Silk Road began looking toward the sea. The ocean, at least, couldn't catch the plague. Or so people hoped. Ports became the new crossroads, and ships the new caravans. The world hadn't stopped trading, it had merely changed vehicles. For now, though, the desert slept. The old roads lay under wind and ash, their milestones half buried. A few stubborn merchants still traced the paths, carrying goods for ghosts and letters to cities that no longer replied. They were relics of a world that had grown too connected for its own good and too proud to admit it. Above them, the stars kept their indifferent watch, shining down like eternal currency, unspent and untouchable. History rarely ends, it just changes its handwriting. And as the 14th century gasped its last, you could almost hear the road itself sigh, a sound made of dust, memory, and a faint promise that someone someday would reopen the gates. The world, exhausted by dust and disease, looked up from its ledgers and noticed the sea. It had always been there, of course, too wide, too wet, and entirely disobedient. But after the Black Death, the ocean began to look like a clean start. The old Silk Road still existed, winding through half-empty cities and half-remembered alliances, but the optimism had sailed elsewhere, quite literally. At the dawn of the 15th century, China turned its gaze toward the horizon. The new Ming dynasty, eager to remind everyone that the world was still organised and that they were the ones organising it, launched a fleet of ships so large that even exaggeration struggles to keep up. Their commander was Zheng He, an admiral, a eunuch, and possibly the most patient man ever to captain a bureaucracy. He led 7 grand voyages between 1405 and 1433, sailing from Nanjing to the coasts of India, Arabia and East Africa, an aquatic Silk Road stitched together by monsoon winds and imperial ambition. Each ship was a floating city. Hundreds of sailors, translators, accountants and cooks who served more paperwork than food. The decks bristled with silk banners and the smell of lacquer and salt. The sailors carried not weapons but porcelain, tea and diplomatic letters written on paper so fine it could have doubled as confidence. The voyages were not meant to conquer but to impress. They arrived in foreign ports like visiting theatre companies, performing wealth. Giraffes were brought back as tribute, the Empire's new favourite metaphor for elegance. For a brief, glittering moment, the world seemed ready to become one enormous harbour. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the experiment ended. The Ming court, suspicious of expenses and foreigners, recalled the fleets. Shipyards closed, blueprints vanished, and the ocean returned to being just a rumour of possibility. China turned inward again, as if embarrassed by its own enthusiasm. History, ever the comedian, left the door open for someone else to take over. That someone was Europe, not because it was wiser, but because it was restless and slightly desperate. By the late 15th century, merchants in Portugal and Spain were dreaming of spices without middlemen, silk without taxes, and glory without maps. The land routes were risky, the Ottoman Empire controlled the choke points, and the sea looked like a loophole that hadn't yet been taxed. So the Europeans built smaller, faster ships, part science, part prayer, and set out in search of everything already owned by someone else. The age of exploration began not with a plan, but with curiosity, greed, and favourable wind. Sailors learned to read the monsoons, those seasonal trade winds that had quietly governed the Indian Ocean for centuries. Arab, Indian and Chinese mariners had long understood their pattern. Europeans simply arrived late to the lesson and claimed discovery rights. They established ports and colonies along the coasts of Africa and Asia, linking oceanic routes into a network that eventually eclipsed the old overland road. Ships became the new caravans, their sails the new desert tents, their crews the new merchants and increasingly the new conquerors. Trade now moved by tide rather than by step. Pepper from Malabar, nutmeg from the Moluccas, silver from the Americas, all funneled through the great maritime crossroads of Goa, Malacca and Hormuz. The ocean turned global trade into something the desert could never be, scalable. A single ship could carry more cargo than an entire caravan, and if it sank, the accounting department merely sighed and sent another. Loss became affordable. This watery version of the Silk Road also carried ideas, languages and diseases, proving once again that globalization never learns its lesson, it just changes its vehicle. In its wake came missionaries and mercenaries, astronomers and accountants, all convinced they were bringing civilization to wherever the tide deposited them. The sea, indifferent and amused, accepted everyone. The Ottoman Empire, inheriting the western stretch of the old road, adapted by controlling the ports and taxing what still moved overland. They built caravanserais grand enough to resemble palaces and bureaucracies, patient enough to rival the tide. Meanwhile, the Portuguese sailed farther east, rounding the Cape of Good Hope and setting up trade posts like stepping stones into someone else's history. Spain looked west, accidentally discovering entire continents while searching for shortcuts to dinner. The map, once centred on desert trails, now sprawled across oceans. The sound of trade changed too. The rhythmic bells of camels gave way to the creak of ships' timbers, the snap of ropes, and the crash of waves against hulls. Markets that once smelled of sand and sweat now smelled of tar and salt. A new kind of merchant appeared, paler, louder, and more likely to measure success in tonnage. The world had found its sea legs. Yet even as the maritime routes grew richer, nostalgia clung to the land. Travellers still wrote about the old road, the silence of the Taklamakan, the hospitality of Samarkand, the ruined majesty of caravanserais under moonlight. The Silk Road became a symbol, half memory, half myth, whispering of a time when trade could still feel personal. On the ocean, profit was vast but anonymous. No one shook hands with a monsoon. Back in the east, the Ming dynasty built the Great Wall higher, a gesture of pride that doubled as a metaphor. The empire's wealth came from within now, rice, porcelain, and poetry. Beyond the wall, the world kept rearranging itself on nautical charts. Europe's rising powers would soon link east and west not through the heart of Asia, but around it, an expensive detour powered by ambition and misunderstanding. By the 16th century, the overland Silk Road was no longer a highway but a legend. A few caravans still plodded through the deserts, their camels aging alongside the empire's memories. Dust covered the milestones, but the idea of connection endured, simply relocating to a new medium. The sea had stolen the stage, but it performed the same script, human desire moving faster than caution. And somewhere, perhaps on the deck of a Portuguese carrack gliding toward a foreign shore, a sailor looked out at the endless water and thought the same thought every merchant had always thought. If this works, we might never need to stop. When the sea took over the stage, the old Silk Road didn't die. It merely started whispering through new empires wearing winter coats. Trade shifted north, winding through Siberian forests and Persian bazaars, finding life in the oddest corners. The caravans that once crossed deserts now trudged through snow. Their bells still rang, only slower, muffled by frost and paperwork. In the 17th century, as Europe began measuring the world in latitude, Asia responded by perfecting the art of waiting. China's Ming dynasty had retreated behind its Great Wall and its own confidence. To the west, the Safavids ruled Persia with a flair for textiles and tax collection. Farther still, the Ottoman Empire turned Istanbul into a marketplace the size of an idea. And across the subcontinent, the Mughal stitched palaces out of marble and commerce. Each empire thought it was the centre of the map, which, mathematically speaking, is how maps work. But the new power rising on the edge of everything was colder, hungrier, and armed with ledgers: Russia. From the Urals to the Pacific, Russian settlers and soldiers pushed east, drawn by fur, frontier, and the vague thrill of adding more landscape to an already unmanageable amount. Their conquest created a land route that eventually connected Europe and China, a road through ice instead of sand. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, and where trade goes, bureaucracy follows like a faithful, nagging companion. At the heart of this frozen network sat Kikakta, a trading post on the Mongolian border. Here, in the 18th century, merchants met under the polite supervision of imperial accountants. They bartered tea for silver, furs for silk, and pleasantries for permission. Everything was recorded in duplicate. One copy for Moscow, one for Beijing, and one extra just in case someone sneezed on the first two. It was commerce conducted with wool hats and diplomatic caution. The main commodity, surprisingly, was tea. In Russia, it became both necessity and national pastime. A caravan of hundreds of camels could take a year to travel from the Chinese border to Moscow, carrying nothing but tea compressed into bricks. Each brick weighed about as much as an argument and could be used as currency, medicine, or emergency conversation starter. By the time the tea reached the samovars of St. Petersburg, it cost its weight in regret, but nobody complained. Warmth, like civilization, was always worth the markup. Alongside tea, the road carried textiles that defined entire economies. The Safavids in Persia perfected the silk and carpet industries, turning threads into theology. A good Persian carpet could outlast its owner's heirs, and looked best when viewed by candlelight and mild gilt. In workshops across Isfahan, dyes bloomed like sunsets. Indigo, madder red, saffron yellow, each shade protected by guild secrets and divine oversight. Merchants sold them to Ottomans, who resold them to Europeans, who resold them to each other, proving that profit multiplies faster than colour fades. The Ottomans, for their part, controlled the vital land bridges between continents. They taxed goods with a precision that bordered on affection. Each merchant entering their domains met an official who could assess value faster than love at first sight. Customs posts multiplied along every route, each with its own form, seal, and interpretation of honesty. If the Silk Road had once been a path of freedom, it was now a path of receipts. Empires discovered that you don't need to conquer the world if you can simply invoice it. Meanwhile, the Mughal Empire in India transformed trade into spectacle. Its courts glimmered with jewels, spices, and imported fabrics. The Emperor Akbar reportedly maintained entire rooms for cataloguing gifts, sorted by size, glitter, and flattery value. Mughal weavers produced muslin so fine it was called woven air. European merchants arrived with silver and left with humility, learning that sometimes even luxury has a waiting list. In return, India received firearms, clocks, and theological confusion, all of which it already had, but now in imported packaging. By the early 18th century, caravans still crossed Central Asia, but their routes were changing tone. The adventure had become administration. Where once travellers carried swords, now they carried export permits. The Silk Road was being audited. Even the caravanserais had taken on a new role. Halfway houses for forms. You could check in with a camel and check out with a receipt for the camel's opinion. Every transaction came with a signature, and every signature came with the possibility of another. The Siberian route, stretching from the Russian heartland to the Pacific, represented the new logic of empire. Control through distance. Wooden forts replaced oasis towns. Where the old Silk Road had measured progress by sand dunes, this one measured it by degrees below freezing. Travellers kept diaries describing landscapes that sounded like hallucinations. Forests so endless that directions felt optional, and nights so cold that words froze before finishing their sentences. Still, the trade persisted, slower, quieter, but constant. It was as if the planet itself refused to stop the conversation started 2,000 years earlier. In this new world, merchants wore furs instead of turbans, carried vodka instead of incense, and still complained about taxes. The smell of camels gave way to the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. Coins jingled in pockets lined with sheepskin, and ink froze before contracts could dry. Commerce had adapted to weather, and bureaucracy, being immortal, simply added new columns labelled temperature. By night, under northern stars, you might see the glow of campfires along the frozen road. Traders boiled tea in brass kettles, steam rising like ghosts of the old caravans. They spoke in a dozen languages, all of which sounded tired but sincere. Somewhere, someone balanced accounts by firelight, wondering how much profit faith was worth this year. The Silk Road, reborn in frost, still hummed with the same rhythm: movement, exchange, and mild complaint. Empires rise and fall, but paperwork accumulates. By the time dawn touched the icy horizon, another caravan would be on the move, its ledgers sealed, its tea secured, and its optimism dutifully signed by 2 witnesses and a minor clerk. The desert might have become tundra, but the business of connection continued, steaming gently in the cold. By the 19th century, the Silk Road had fallen mostly silent. The desert had swallowed the caravan tracks, the caravanserais had turned into museums of loneliness, and the world had moved on to steam. But empires are like magpies. They can't resist glitter, even when it's ancient. And so, While the locals quietly lived among the ruins of their own history, outsiders arrived with measuring tapes, rifles, and something far more dangerous: curiosity backed by funding. The age of the camel was ending. The age of the railway had begun. Metal tracks stretched across Central Asia like new veins of ambition. The British built theirs from the west, the Russians from the north, and both met somewhere in the middle, glaring at each other through clouds of coal smoke. It was called the Great Game, a phrase that sounded playful enough until you realised the pieces were entire countries. Spies mapped mountains disguised as monks. Surveyors drew borders through people's living rooms, and engineers competed to see who could lay track faster than diplomacy could object. The British called their rail lines civilizing. The Russians called theirs necessary. Both meant profitable. Steel replaced sand as the symbol of progress. A journey that once took months by camel could now be done in days, though it lacked the romance of dehydration. Steam engines didn't need rest or forgiveness. They just needed coal and optimism. For a while, it seemed the dream of connection had found its final smokier form. But railways are more than transportation. They are declaration. Each track claimed territory, each station a flag. The Russians drove south toward Turkestan, building the Trans-Caspian Railway through landscapes that responded mainly with wind. Every station master became a minor czar, every timetable an act of empire. Meanwhile, the British fortified their routes toward India, guarding them like veins full of imperial blood. To them, the Silk Road was no longer a network of exchange. It was a chessboard made of geography and arrogance. And while these empires built, a new kind of traveller appeared, the archaeologist. Part scholar, part scavenger, armed with notebooks and entitlement, he wandered the ruins of Central Asia in search of history that wasn't nailed down. One of the most famous was Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-born British explorer who treated the desert like a reading room. He followed the ghost of the old Silk Road from oasis to oasis, uncovering manuscripts, statues, and anything else that fit neatly into a shipping crate. When he reached Dunhuang, he found the sealed library cave, untouched for centuries, and promptly unsealed it in the name of scholarship. Thousands of scrolls, paintings, and documents were packed up and shipped west, where they could be safely admired far from the people who made them. He was not alone. Paul Pelliot, a French linguist, followed, charming local monks with fluency and flattery. German expeditions arrived with funding from Kaiser Wilhelm, and enthusiasm unburdened by guilt. The Russians sent their own teams, claiming they were preserving history, a claim slightly weakened by the size of their luggage. By the early 20th century, half of Central Asia's past was on display in Europe's museums, labelled neatly in languages its creators never spoke. As one observer later put it, they stole statues to prove who civilized whom. To be fair, these explorers were also scholars, and their notes preserved countless details that would otherwise have vanished. But the moral arithmetic remained uneasy. They treated culture as treasure and memory as property. The Silk Road, once the shared artery of civilizations, had become a museum exhibit managed by curators who mistook possession for preservation. History, it seemed, was easier to admire when it belonged to someone else. Meanwhile, the railways kept advancing, dragging telegraph wires and bureaucracy behind them. The Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in the early 20th century, stitched Russia to the Pacific like a long, metallic scar. It turned travel into an equation of hours rather than seasons. Tea, wool, and news now moved at the pace of steam instead of patience. For the first time in history, a message could outrun its messenger. Progress had learned to speak faster than understanding, yet in all this motion, something still lingered in the dust. Local traders, riding small donkeys along forgotten tracks, carried spices, carpets, and gossip between towns the railroads ignored. They belonged to no empire and paid taxes only when someone caught them. For them, the Silk Road never ended. It merely changed costume. They passed by the survey teams and the archaeologists with the quiet indifference of people who had seen too many conquerors come and go. The railways eventually brought prosperity, but also consequences. Old oasis towns lost their importance. New cities sprang up around stations instead. The geography of civilization shifted from water to steel. Nomads were told to settle. Traders were told to register. Everything that moved was expected to produce receipts. The freedom that had once defined the Silk Road was now measured in schedules. By night, under the same stars that once guided caravans, trains now thundered across the plains. Passengers dozed in compartments lined with brass, dreaming of adventure while being gently reminded by the whistle that adventure had become time-tabled. Outside, the desert stretched on, unchanged and unimpressed. Sand whispered over rails as if testing whether the Empire's metal would outlast its wind. It rarely did. In the end, the Great Game produced what most games do: exhaustion, a few impressive trophies, and the faint realization that no one had truly won. The British and Russians both left behind maps full of straight lines that ignored mountains, languages, and logic. The archaeologists left behind empty caves and full museums, and the Silk Road, though quieter than before, kept breathing beneath it all, patient, stubborn, and amused. Progress had built its tracks directly over the bones of history, and when the trains finally rusted, the desert reclaimed them with the same slow courtesy it had shown every conqueror before. The wind began its old work again, covering footprints, erasing ambition, humming softly through the hollow shells of carriages like a lullaby for empire. The road had survived another transformation, from caravan to train, from camel to steel. It had changed languages, vehicles, and gods, but it still meant the same thing it always had: the human desire to keep moving, even when there's nowhere left to go. By the early 20th century, the desert had grown quiet again. The caravans were gone, the trains were slower, and the only thing still moving with enthusiasm were historians. Everywhere along the old Silk Road, the sound of shovels replaced the sound of camel bells. Empires no longer conquered, they curated. The new fashion was ownership by explanation. Europe's museums swelled like overfed libraries, each promising to preserve the past on behalf of those who had lived it. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Berlin State Museum, and a dozen others began expanding their Asian collections, which is an elegant way of saying everything they could carry home. Aurel Stein's crates from Dunhuang arrived in London by ship and train, labelled with careful handwriting and moral ambiguity. Pelliot's hall decorated Parisian archives. Berlin displayed statues from Turfen. St. Petersburg catalogued manuscripts from Samarkand. Civilization, it seemed, was now measured in glass cases. The justification was always the same: preservation. The archaeologists claimed they were rescuing treasures from decay, as though the desert were a burglar rather than a landscape. They saw the locals as indifferent, not realizing that memory needs no museum to survive. In truth, every artifact taken away also took away context: the air, the soil, the echo that gave it meaning. A scroll in a London cabinet may survive forever, but it will never again sound like the cave wind that once brushed across it. Still, the 20th century adored progress, and progress adored cataloguing. Scholars translated, photographed, and debated. A new language of cultural property emerged, a polite dialect of ownership disguised as scholarship. The old Silk Road had carried silk and salt. The new one carried paperwork. There were forms for excavation, forms for export, forms certifying that the other forms existed. Bureaucracy had finally achieved immortality. Even ruin required permission. Meanwhile, the people who still lived along the old routes watched with mild confusion. To them, the ruins were familiar neighbours, not holy relics. Farmers took bricks from ancient walls to build barns. Shepherds sheltered their flocks under 1,000-year-old arches. The past was not a thing to be admired from behind a rope. It was simply part of the landscape, another kind of inheritance, practical and unceremonious. When foreign archaeologists lectured them about preservation, they nodded politely, then used the lecture tent poles to dry laundry. But time, as always, rearranges the arguments. After the wars of the 20th century, a new institution emerged to coordinate conscience. UNESCO, founded in 1945 to remind humanity that memory works better when shared. By the late 20th century, the organisation began designating parts of the Silk Road as World Heritage Sites. It was a noble idea: international cooperation to protect common history. In practice, it meant more meetings, more forms, and the comforting sound of consensus, written in 12 official languages. The preserved sites included everything from caravanserais and Buddhist caves to sections of the Great Wall and ancient irrigation systems. Each came with a plaque, a budget, and a promise that tourists would behave. Some did. Most bought souvenirs shaped like what they had just damaged. But even with its contradictions, the movement signalled something remarkable. The Silk Road had become a shared memory instead of a contested one. The road no longer divided, it connected again, not through trade, but through nostalgia. Museums began to change their tone too. By the end of the century, curators faced an uncomfortable question. Should the treasures go home? Countries like China, India, and Uzbekistan politely asked for their history back, and the museums politely declined, citing logistics, preservation, or the unspoken principle of finders, keepers. Occasionally, a small item was ceremonially returned, a gesture that looked generous if you didn't check the inventory. The debates grew endless and poetic. Does art belong to the world or to the ground it came from? Can memory be global without being stolen? Behind these polite arguments, real people still searched for belonging. In Dunhuang, scholars began digital projects to scan the ancient manuscripts Stein had taken, creating online archives accessible to anyone with electricity and curiosity. In Xi'an, restorers cleaned the faded frescoes of Tangara pagodas using toothbrushes and faith. In Uzbekistan, young archaeologists excavated the ruins their grandparents had walked past without noticing. Each act of preservation, whether high-tech or humble, was an attempt to reconcile admiration with ownership, to prove that memory could be both cared for and free. The air around these sites carries a strange dual scent: dust and disinfectant, old time and new guilt. Visitors move slowly, whispering as if the ruins might be sleeping. Tour guides speak of empires with the same tenderness used for lost relatives. In some places, solar panels now power the spotlights that illuminate statues once hidden from sunlight for centuries. The gods of the old Silk Road never imagined they'd be resurrected by electricity. Every generation invents its own form of pilgrimage. In the 21st century, tourists have replaced monks and merchants, carrying cameras instead of scriptures. They walk through restored caravanserais, take pictures beside reconstructed walls, and post captions about the magic of ancient trade. The irony, of course, is that they are once again moving ideas and images across continents, recreating the road in digital form. The Silk Road has gone online, wrapped in pixels instead of parchment. Yet even now, the moral paperwork continues. New treaties define cultural heritage, new committees discuss repatriation, and new exhibitions promise to reunite East and West, temporarily under controlled lighting. The same instinct that once sent caravans into the unknown now sends curators into archives. Connection has survived, it's just better dressed. As night settles over a museum somewhere, London, Paris, Beijing, take your pick, the hall grows quiet. A statue from Gandhara stands under soft light, its face calm, its shadow long. Behind the glass, its expression seems almost amused. It has crossed continents, survived centuries, and now endures the most peculiar fate of all, being safe. Around it, the air smells faintly of climate control and compromise. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whisper of the desert it once faced. a faint reminder that history never really belongs to anyone who tries to own it. The Silk Road has always had a talent for resurrection. Every few centuries it wakes up wearing new clothes. Once it was silk and horses, then it became paper and ships. Now it hums beneath our feet, a network of glass threads and steel corridors that whisper instead of gallop. The old road never truly ended, it simply went online. In the 21st century, countries began speaking again in the language of connection. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched by China in 2013, promised to rebuild the ancient trade routes on a modern scale. Railways instead of caravans, ports instead of oases, and spreadsheets instead of scrolls. The name itself was poetic and bureaucratic at once. Belt for the land routes, road for the sea lanes, though neither looked much like its namesake. It was an empire-sized idea, a map drawn not in sand or ink, but in infrastructure. New rail lines began stretching across Eurasia like veins of ambition. Freight trains rolled from Xi'an to Hamburg, carrying electronics where once camels carried spices. Container ships glided across the Indian Ocean under flags of convenience and optimism. Pipelines traced ancient caravan paths underground, turning fuel into the new silk, lighter, faster, and considerably more flammable. Highways, power plants, and special economic zones sprouted like bureaucratic flowers. It was the world's oldest metaphor reborn as policy. To its supporters, this modern Silk Road promised shared prosperity, cultural exchange, and a future where cooperation replaced competition. To its critics, it looked suspiciously like déjà vu with better branding, the same empires, the same ambitions, just smoother PowerPoint slides. Both were probably right. The genius of the Silk Road has always been its ability to make self-interest sound like friendship. What made the new version different was speed. Trains that once took months to cross Asia now did it in under 2 weeks. Digital signals did it in less than a second. Fibre optic cables followed the same paths as the old caravan routes, buried deep under soil once walked by horses. You could send a message from Istanbul to Shanghai faster than the time it takes to drink a cup of tea, which in historical terms is almost impolite. Trade had finally reached the velocity of thought. Yet even at this pace, some old lessons resurfaced. A new road means new disputes over tolls, ownership, and influence. Maps, once again, became political documents disguised as geometry. Countries argued over ports, loans, and whose history deserved to headline the brochures. Empires may fall, but their accountants never retire. Still, amid the noise, something familiar persisted. The instinct to connect, to build corridors instead of walls, to move things simply because they can be moved. Alongside the concrete and rail came something invisible but equally vast: the digital Silk Road. Data cables and satellites carried information instead of spices, algorithms instead of incense. The merchants of this age wore headsets instead of turbans and dealt in terabytes rather than bolts of cloth. But the principle was the same. Find value, move it, repeat. Instead of caravanserais, we built cloud servers. Instead of tea houses, we built social networks, gathering places for digital pilgrims who never had to leave their chairs. The hum of the old Silk Road had become the gentle buzz of routers in the dark, and as before, trust became the true currency. The Hawala brokers of medieval Bukhara would have recognized the logic of modern online transactions. Reputation equals reliability. Back then, a merchant's word was his bond. Today, it's a password protected by encryption rather than honour. We still trade on belief. Only now we call it data integrity. Every technology, no matter how advanced, ends up imitating the human need to be believed. The new Silk Road, like the old one, carries more than commerce. Students, tourists, and engineers follow its routes, filling planes instead of caravans. ideas flow across borders: architecture, cuisine, pop music, conspiracy theories, blending just as freely as spices once did. A restaurant in Kazakhstan serves Chinese noodles with Italian tomatoes and Indian spices. A designer in Uzbekistan streams inspiration from Seoul. The cross-pollination continues, still slightly chaotic, still beautifully unplanned. Cultural diffusion has simply upgraded its bandwidth. Meanwhile, the ruins of the ancient road sit quietly, watching all this motion with the patience of stone. At Dunhuang, fibre optic cables pass beneath the same cliffs where Buddhist monks once painted visions of paradise. In Samarkand, streetlights powered by solar panels illuminate blue-tiled domes that have seen every version of globalization. The hum of modern machinery joins the desert wind in a duet that feels oddly familiar. Technology has become the new camel, tireless and temperamental. Of course, every age believes it has solved the riddle of permanence. The Tang dynasty thought so with its postal stations, the Mongols with their relay riders, the Victorians with their telegraphs, and now we think so with our Wi-Fi. But permanence is a trick the road has never promised. It exists only in motion, in the endless rewriting of distance into connection. Today's belt and road may last a century or a decade or until the next crisis of ambition. But something of it, the urge, the pattern, the line across the map, will survive, as it always has. At night, in a logistics hub somewhere in Central Asia, freight trains wait under fluorescent lights. Their cargo lists read like a census of human invention: smartphones, engines, textiles, dreams. A worker scans barcodes, the laser beeping in rhythm with the heart of modern commerce. Outside, the cold air smells faintly of diesel and tea. Far above, satellites blink like patient stars, relaying data between continents that once needed camels to communicate. It's all the same story, told again in steel and code. The Silk Road has become quiet once more, but this time the silence is electronic, a hum of servers, a whisper of global traffic passing invisibly through cables under sand and sea. And if you lean close enough to the sound, you can almost hear the ancient rhythm inside it. The steady heartbeat of movement, trust, and curiosity that refuses to die. The Silk Road has never really been about silk, or even about roads. It has always been about what happens when people decide to keep walking toward each other instead of away. For 2,000 years, it has been humanity's most persistent conversation, one conducted in a dozen languages, through trade, faith, art, and occasionally mild extortion. Now, as we stand in the age of satellites and high-speed nostalgia, it's worth asking what the road still remembers that we keep forgetting. The first lesson is simple, though it often needs repeating. Connection is older than control. Long before any empire drew its borders, caravans were already ignoring them. Every dynasty that tried to fence in the road ended up discovering the limits of fences. The Han built protectorates, the Tang built law codes, the Mongols built an empire so large it nearly wrapped around itself, and still, trade flowed wherever human curiosity found a gap. The Silk Road's geography was its rebellion. You can map it, tax it, rename it, but you can never quite own it. The second lesson is subtler. Exchange is memory in motion. A bolt of silk carried more than fabric. It carried fingerprints. A scroll copied in Dunhuang preserved the breath of a monk who refused to sleep. A coin minted in Bukhara travelled farther than its ruler ever dreamed. Even the spices that perfumed foreign kitchens became silent ambassadors of forgotten kingdoms. Every trade, however small, left behind a trace, a colour, a taste, a word that refused to translate perfectly. That is how history hides itself inside daily life, waiting to be rediscovered in recipes and metaphors. The third lesson is inconvenient but true. Progress and peril share the same road. The same routes that carried paper and philosophy also carried plague. The same ships that linked continents also imported conquest. Connectivity never arrives alone. It always travels with its shadow. The Mongols built safety and spread disaster. Europe mapped the world and then rearranged it. Even our modern fibre-optic roads carry both truth and misinformation with equal efficiency. The road doesn't judge, it merely delivers. What we send along it, kindness or contagion, knowledge or noise, is still our choice. The fourth lesson is quietly hopeful. Trust outlives technology. The earliest traders carried no contracts, only reputations. Centuries later, bankers invented paper, lawyers invented clauses, and computers invented passwords. Yet all of it still rests on belief. Belief that the message will arrive, that the coin is genuine, that the promise means something. The Silk Road thrived not because of armies, but because of faith, not the religious kind, but the practical, everyday faith that strangers can keep their word. It's an optimism disguised as commerce, and it has survived every collapse so far. There's another lesson, almost invisible. Beauty travels better than truth. Empires traded laws, but art lasted longer. The Gandharan sculptors who carved Greek drapery into Buddhist robes didn't mean to invent a new aesthetic. They just did. Persian carpet weavers turned geometry into philosophy. Chinese painters borrowed foreign pigments and made them look inevitable. Centuries later, the art remains, quietly contradicting every argument about purity or isolation. A road that began as commerce became, unintentionally, a gallery of human imagination. And perhaps the last lesson is the hardest. Nothing we build lasts, but everything we share does. The Silk Road cities have collapsed, its caravans dissolved into sand, its empires turned into exam questions. Yet the idea that movement can be meaning survives. Even the term Silk Road, invented only in the 19th century by a German geographer, became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. It gave the past a brand and the future a direction. We still use it today because it names something we can feel but not quite measure, the need to stay in conversation. If you stand now in any of its ancient waypoints, Samarkand, Xi'an, Kashgar, or even a forgotten village on the edge of the Gobi, you can sense it. The air hums differently. There's always someone telling a story that doesn't end where you expect. The sound of wind through ruined arches feels like the whisper of unfinished sentences, and the smell, dust, cumin, sunlight, reminds you that trade is simply memory that refuses to die. The road teaches patience too. Every civilization that walked it believed it was permanent. Every one of them learned otherwise. The Hun fell to rebels, the Tang to intrigue, the Mongols to overextension, the Europeans to exhaustion, and we have email outages. But the pattern remains. Curiosity collapses, then reappears in new shoes. Perhaps the true continuity of the Silk Road isn't its geography, but its attitude, the willingness to begin again, even after disaster. In a way, the modern world is just another caravan, larger, faster, and slightly more confused. Planes have replaced camels, currencies have gone digital, and instead of scrolls, we carry smartphones full of opinions. But the rhythm is familiar. The exchange of goods, ideas, and stories across landscapes that refuse to stay separate. The same desire for connection that once lit beacon towers now lights computer screens. We've built empires of bandwidth and called it progress. But the ancient road would recognize the tone, that same hopeful hum of humans trying once again to understand each other. And so, after 2,000 years, the Silk Road still offers advice. It whispers that progress isn't about distance travelled, but distance understood. That trade without empathy is theft, and isolation without imagination is sleep. It reminds us that the maps we draw are temporary, but the questions we ask along the way, who are you? What do you need? Can we share this? Are eternal. If you listen carefully tonight, maybe you can still hear it. The faint jingle of a camel bell, the rustle of parchment under a monk's brush, the whistle of a train cutting across a steppe, or the digital heartbeat of a signal crossing continents under dark seas. All of them are versions of the same sound, the steady pulse of connection. Somewhere, the wind crosses an empty pass where no traveller has walked in centuries. It moves softly through the ruins of a caravanserai, past the cracked walls where tea once steamed and arguments once bloomed. It carries with it a scent of earth and distance, and if you let your mind wander with it, you might feel a small, quiet truth. The road never really left us. It simply changed form, as all living things do. What remains is the habit of reaching outward, the instinct that made strangers into neighbours, and neighbours into storytellers. The Silk Road is not behind us. It runs through us. In every word borrowed, every idea shared, every gesture of trust that crosses between hands, empires rise and fall, customs, forms multiply. But the conversation continues, unbroken, soft as dust, endless as breath. And perhaps that more than any monument is what civilization was trying to build all along,